I'm turning 65 at the end of the week, and I've always celebrated on Valentine's Day. So I've been doing some quiet reflection, nothing heavy, just noticing. And here's what surprised me the most. I have never lived completely alone before leaving my last relationship. I was wired to believe that I needed a relationship. And when I first became single, it was terrifying. I had never lived alone, completely alone before. The lack of obligation should feel freer, but it also meant no attachments. And that brought up fear. I mean, what if something happened to me? When a marriage is hard and you've invested years, even decades into it, this line I kept repeating was this: but when we grow old, we'll take care of each other, always in fear of the future. But I was compromising my present. For most of my life, I believed that being alone would be incredibly scary and lonely. So I worked very hard on my relationships, harder than most. I stayed connected. I stayed loyal. I was very available, chronically so. I stayed long after relationships stopped feeling safe or reciprocal. And like many people pleasers, I believed something deeply. If someone says they love me, I won't feel lonely. That turned out not to be true. Because the loneliest years of my life happened while sitting and waiting for connection to happen with someone who had made that very claim, who made a sacred vow in front of church and family. And it's not because anyone was intentionally cruel, not because there were never attempts at connection, but because I wasn't safe to be fully myself. That connection was largely a figment of my imagination based on early words and future thinking, believing this was just a rough patch right now. We're going to laugh about this one day. I was a hopeless romantic. And hope, well, that word did a lot of heavy lifting. To keep that image and hope alive, usually without realizing it, I was monitoring, managing, explaining, over-explaining, softening my needs, trying to fit in, second guessing my reactions. They're not important. I kept the peace, and over time, I lost pieces of myself. That kind of relational labor creates a very specific loneliness. It's the loneliness of not being met. People pleasers don't always see this right away. In fact, they usually don't. We're focused on keeping the relationship intact. People pleasing is a trauma response. It's survival mode. So we stop asking the harder questions to keep the peace. Do I feel emotionally safe here? Not important. Can I be honest and feel seen or heard? That's not so important. Am I allowed to take space? Oh, I can make myself smaller. Can I be different from the other person or even from their family? And we confuse attachment with the legal commitment we made and with connection. And attachment without emotional safety, well, that's incredibly lonely. For a long time, I thought the answer was to try harder. Be more understanding, be more patient, be more forgiving, flexible, accommodating, whatever. But love isn't measured by how much you take on and endure, unless you're in a parent-child relationship. But adult love, that's measured by how much room there is for both people to exist and to grow together. And there has to be a willingness on both sides. When I finally left after years of trying to have those real conversations, he was upset with me. And he said what I had been thinking. We're supposed to grow old together. And it wasn't cruelty when I said, I'm so tired of feeling this old. It was honesty. Now I love living completely alone. My nervous system is calm. But learning to be with myself, that was harder at first. I'd never been first in my own life, except early in romantic relationships. No one had shown an interest in my needs. And I didn't believe that I deserved that kind of attention, not even from myself. And being alone, something unexpected happened. The quiet gave me room to heal, room to breathe, room to deepen my relationship with spirit with intuition, with my internal guidance system. Some people call God a guidance system. They use God as an acronym for good, orderly direction. And I love that. I totally get it. I've seen that play out in my life now. Not dramatically, it just relaxes. It relaxes everything. I accepted that I needed space and that I could now take it. Space to think, to feel, space to ask honest questions. Socrates said the unexamined life is not worth living. And you know what? I agree with that. I look back at my whole life. I turned over those emotional rocks and the spiritual ones and how they shaped how I related to others at home, at work, at play, in the world. And I see how often I put myself in harm's way in those relationships. And I ask God why I had to hurt so much. There were periods of deep resentment and deep, deep grief, which I had to turn over those rocks and let them go. And what I came to understand was this: I was afraid of suffering while alone. And while trying to avoid that fear, I gave my power away just to avoid being alone. Now, family dynamics shaped my identity, and I believed that I needed approval to be okay because I had been a scapegoat growing up. So I avoided conflict. I avoided upsetting others, being a target. I developed magical thinking. It got me through. I believed that one day, even if they weren't reciprocating now, they would. Yeah, that's a terrible plan. I had disconnected from myself while trying to stay connected to others. That doesn't work. But when I finally allowed myself some space for internal connections, things started changing. I reclaimed something grounding that I had lost. My instincts came back online. I don't have the life I once imagined I would have at this age. I will not be celebrating this milestone the way I thought. The storyline just didn't follow the script. But I feel more connected to myself, more grounded, more at home in my skin. And that never happened when I was trying to earn that sense of belonging. I've learned something important. Belonging doesn't come from being needed. It comes from being wanted and emotionally met. Now let's go back to Valentine's Day. Even if it's not around your birthday, it does put a spotlight on romantic attachment. And subconsciously, I always noticed my relationship status around my birthday, and I gave it too much power. For people pleasers, this deeper ache isn't missing romance, it's exhaustion. Always adapting, always understanding, always forgiving, always holding everything together, painting on a smile, meeting expectations just to avoid rejection. That kind of love looks good from outsiders, but it's incredibly lonely on the inside. And lately there's been a lot more gentleness in my life, especially in my relationships with women. A lot of women call Valentine's Day Galentine's Day, celebrating friendship instead of romantic pressure. And honestly, that makes more sense to me than ever. It's much more intentional now about who I spend time with. If there's no reciprocation, if there's no effort to connect or repair, I just respect myself enough to step back. I've learned that being alone is not something to fear. It's something to honor. And since practicing this level of self-care, I'm attracting different dynamics. Confident, kind, self-aware women, just doing their best. They share humor and honesty. They carry their own feelings. We support each other mutually. You know, there's a real safety in that. For decades, I poured all my energy into one exhausting relationship at a time. It felt like two horses were pulling a cart, and one of them was laying down. Now, if you've ever been the horse that keeps pulling anyway, you know how exhausting that is. That's emotional labor when it's not shared. What's different now is this, that the women in my life pull their part of the emotional weight. They show up. They reflect. They're open to repair when something goes sideways. It doesn't even matter who caused the problem. There's just so much honesty and love. I'm no longer dragging the cart alone. And that's given me so many gifts. Less financial security, that's for sure. but far more emotional security. And you can always rebuild money, but unhealthy relationships are not asset builders. They're termites in the walls, quietly eating away at the structure. So, to celebrate my birthday this year, I'll be spending my day and my evening with wonderful women. No pressure, no performance, no cart to pull all by myself, just presence, gentleness, breaking bread together, and laughter. It can get pretty silly. I was talking to some new acquaintances a couple of weeks ago, and we were discussing purpose and God, big questions. And I shared an old TV episode from All in the Family. Mike, who was played by Rob Reiner, or as Archie called him, Meathead, is arguing about God not existing. And what about all the big questions and suffering? Like, if God is so great, why are there wars or hunger or childhood cancer? It's not fair. And Archie gets frustrated and says, I'll tell you exactly why God lets all that happen. And then he turns to his wife and says, Edith, tell him. And she pauses and she's like, and she says, maybe so that when you get to heaven, you'll notice the improvement. I've always loved that line. Not because it explains suffering, but because it feels so human and oddly comforting. Without contrast, how would we know we're on the right path? So I'll be turning 65 by the time you're watching this, and my serenity came with hard-earned lessons. I had to look inward, get honest, and look upward for guidance. And I see the improvements. I don't try to control outcomes anymore. I notice what's real and what fits with truth. I look for evidence. I've let go of many resentments, especially the ones I held against myself for being so naive. And now I have a little more peace, a lot more space, and a nervous system that no longer feels crushed by shame or loneliness. So I'm turning 65 with less certainty than I imagined, but far more freedom than I thought possible. And I'm not celebrating the absence of loneliness, but the presence of peace. It's not going to be the party I planned, but there are some neat perks. First of all, I get to eat all the chocolate myself, guilt-free. But mostly, that cart I'm pulling is less heavy. And people walk beside me now. This season reminds me of something simple. You don't have to pull the cart alone. And if you feel invisible, that's not love. And you deserve to feel deeply loved. And that is my wish for you, to feel deeply loved. So happy Valentine's Day. Or Galentine's Day, whichever makes you happiest and brings you the most joy, because you matter.